Hello, everybody. This is Craig Campbell from NerdBurger Games. I own the thing. I'm the lead designer, although for all the games that I work on, a whole bunch of people help to make it happen: writers, editors, illustrators, cartographers, layout people, graphic designers, playtesters, all that fun stuff. Kickstarter backers, everybody. But I'm the guy that kind of wrangles all that together and does the bulk of the design work for the game. We're going to start this little discussion with talking about how Good Strong Hands has come into being. Good Strong Hands, for those who are uninitiated, is a tabletop role-playing game about fey beings and their human allies who are struggling to save their world from being destroyed by a faceless, malevolent force called the Void, capital V. It draws its inspiration from movies like Legend, Neverending Story, Labyrinth, Dark Crystal. I have not watched the series yet, but I hope to soon. And then, some other things like Willow and Pan's Labyrinth and so forth. The idea is that your characters are fighting to stop the Void from destroying your home, which is called Reverie. Good Strong Hands is, you can see like here, to get kind of where it started was in an outline, which is to kind of define what the game is all about. And so the outline you will find is very scattershot. There's a lot of stuff that's kind of thrown in there and you'll even find that there are things in here that I'll be like, ignore that because I'm not doing that anymore. But I hang on to it in the outline because I might return to it. But the game is about losing your world. It's about, think Neverending Story, where the world is going to be consumed by the nothing. So what you're out to do as characters is to prevent that from happening and save your world and help your friends and your family and so forth. And so one of the things that I've just been kind of toying around with is the idea of loss. Like, what things can you lose? Your childhood, your innocence or sense of wonder, memories, friends, your first love, your parents, prized possessions, your soul, your mind, physical ability. So you can expect adventures to kind of hit on those types of things in a sort of metaphorical, allegorical sense. The game started with like what the format is going to be, and it started with kind of being a traditional RPG with a GM and players, and it is still that, but it also has sort of turned into a challenge for myself, and that's something that all of the game designs that I have, like every game design has kind of been a challenge to myself to do something. And with Good Strong Hands, the idea that it's morphed into is to be a challenge for creating a game that will be like a relatively small scale game. I'm expecting it to be a 6x9 book, maybe about 100 or so pages, where you can pick up and play the game very quickly, very easily. You'll hear occasionally the train or sirens in the background because I live kind of in a busy place. Sorry about that. So initially, the idea was like you'd have a character and you'll be this fey creature, or maybe a human, and you'll have a whole bunch of you'll have your traits that are like your strength, dexterity, wisdom, whatever. But then you'll have abilities that you can draw upon, and those abilities have become called talents. And the idea being that you could, you start with just a couple of talents, and as you go, you build, you gain more. And originally I was thinking well, okay, I'm going to have I'll have a bunch of pages of 100 talents. And as I went along, I thought, well, that makes character creation kind of a bear. Capers kind of does that because there's 40 powers in the game, so you got to pick a power and make a bunch of choices about it. So over the course of time, it turned into using playbooks, which is to say each character type, each fey creature type or human or whatever has a playbook that you'll still make some choices about your traits, but then you'll have a set list of talents that playbook has access to. So a particular Fey creature will be able to do certain things, like wildkin, which are kind of like anthropomorphized animal people, like rabbit people and fox people and things like that. They'll have things that they can do that are kind of what they do, and that's gone through a few iterations, but it built into the idea that you can have players create characters very quickly. And of course, if players can create characters very quickly, and I want this game to be able to be picked up and played very quickly, that means two other things. One, the rule system has to be very simple, because even if you don't know the rule system, I want you to be able to learn it in a very short period of time, like maybe 10 minutes of reading the rules. So the rules need to be like 6 or 8 pages tops to cover all the basic rules. And then also the GM needs to be able to be ready to run a game very quickly. And with a lot of RPGs, that means having an adventure prepared. Adventures, as you people who are familiar with RPGs know, that adventures can get really, really long. And my thought was to have, instead of getting into super deep adventures, to draw upon the tropes of fantasy stories, games set in fantasy worlds, and just provide 2-page spreads in the book that are game adventure outlines, so that in the book we can have 10, 15, 20 adventure outlines of all sorts of different adventures that the GM can read those very quickly and say, okay, now I know enough to go on. And then as a corollary to that, it also means that I don't need the GMs creating a lot of stuff themselves, because they're going to read the adventure and be ready to go. I don't want them to have to stat up monsters. I don't want them to be digging around for information on NPCs and monsters and spells and powers and whatever else. So I decided the rule system needed to be player-facing. In the game, in good, strong hands, only the players roll dice. So the GM can sit there with the book open to that 2-page adventure, and they can run everything from that. They don't need to be looking up a bunch of other stuff other than to just kind of reference the rules occasionally if they need to. I hope everybody's following along with this. Feel free to throw questions into the chat. I'm keeping an eye on it. I don't want this to just be me, blurting, babbling stuff out there. I'm happy to answer questions. But you'll see, in the basic idea was all sorts of things to address the idea, the difference between darkness and humor. Want to keep it light, but then also have, kind of the darkness of the world, almost coming to an end or potentially coming to an end. Are there magic items? How do they work? Is there a variant of the game that can be family friendly? That kind of tones the darkness down a little bit and allow parents to play with their kids, sort of thing. And then I started looking at what are, outside of the characters, what do the GMs have to work with? What are the minions of the void? And I've got a list here of, goblins, giants, ghosts, imps, witches, things that people recognize from fantasy literature and games and so forth, so that I don't have to tell you what a dragon is. I don't need to define a dragon, because the GM doesn't have to roll any dice for the dragons. The characters deal with the dragon. And then, of course, good monsters like the unicorns or a phoenix, or there could be good dragons. There can be eagles, out of fantasy, Lord of the Rings kind of, goodly eagles, hearts, which is to say noble deer that live in the forest. And so, I've just started to make, this is the outline. This is kind of where this all started to slowly build. This is a list of things that I can include in the game. When I write these adventures, I can throw in a dragon, or I can throw in a unicorn. The rules kind of broke down as how am I going to do the character sheet? On the left side you got a bunch of stuff, on the right side you got a bunch of stuff, and I need to be able to provide that information. And we'll talk about it. We'll throw a character sheet up there, a character playbook in the near future here. And then I got into what is a character? The character has 4 traits: body, mind, charm, and heart. Body is their physical side, mind is everything mental, charm is everything social, and heart is the character's sort of inner fortitude, strength of will, their dedication. And in the case of magic, they use their heart to cast magical types of things, to make magic happen, even though there's not a spell list. There's just magical things that characters can do. The base game mechanics is, again, the mechanics need to be really simple. We're talking D6s. Your traits are going to be ranked 1 to 4. You're going to roll multiple dice. You're shooting for target numbers. You're counting the number of successes that you get on those dice versus a target number of 4, 5, or 6. No successes means failure. If you get a success, it means you do the thing. If you get more than one success, it means other stuff. It means you do things better. And then I kind of outlined, well, what happens if you don't get successes? What happens if you get one success? What happens if you get multiple successes? And I wanted each of those conditions to be built around the idea that they have consequences other than just the success or failure. So if you have no successes on a check, there's also a complication. You fail to do the thing, but then also something bad happens, so you have to deal with that at some point. If you succeed with exactly one hit, that is to say you get one die that hits your target number or better, you succeed. And then you also mark a spirit, but we'll talk about the 3 tracks in a moment. And then if you get more than one hit, more than one die that hits your target number, it's extra good. You get a boon, like you do the thing better, but you also mark something called shadow. And the idea there being that there's 3 tracks. There's skill, spirit, and shadow. If you fail, you mark a skill. If you succeed with one success, you mark a spirit. And if you succeed with more than one success, you also, for every additional success that you get, you mark shadow. Skill is experience. So as you fail at things, you learn how to do them better. So you can eventually, once you get enough skill on your skill track, you can improve something. If you succeed, you mark a spirit, and the spirit becomes a track of points that you can spend on doing all sorts of cool things to help your characters succeed in the future. And then if you get more than one hit, you gain a boon, you're successful, but you mark an additional shadow for every die that rolls success beyond the first. And when you fill up your shadow track, you gain a corruption. The idea being that as your character becomes more powerful, as the character becomes better at what they're doing, they start to actually take a bite out of what the void is up to. The void starts to notice them. And when you succeed really, really well and get those multiple successes, the void notices you, and you mark shadow. And when you fill up the shadow track, you gain a corruption, which is a cool ability that your character can do, but it's dark and it's corrupted and it's evil. And if you gain too many corruptions, your character falls to the void and becomes a bad guy, becomes an NPC, becomes evil, whatever. And then there's, additional basic kind of rules stuff, like you can gain advantage or disadvantage to gain an extra die or lose a die. There's different ways to spend spirit that you gain, so you can use it to gain extra dice. You can also use spirit to power talents that require spirit. Some of your talents require you to actually spend a spirit because they're a little more powerful than your typical talents. And then, of course, you gain that shadow and you gain these corruptions, and you can use those corruptions to do great things, but they are dark and nasty. And the void is very, very happy that you are corrupted. So that's the basics of the system. There's a little more complexity to that. Hey there, Clear Shades, whoever you are. I might know who you are. I kind of went over the basics of the rule system for Good Strong Hands. I hope that you can follow along when we go to look at a character sheet to see what all of that kind of stuff looks like. So let's do that. You'll see like the rest of the outline is like, here's the different types of characters. You got brownies and gnomes and pixies and wildkin and fey touched and blah, 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 all sorts of stuff. Minor magics. We'll talk about that. Hey, Chris. Welcome aboard. I've got these, the list of the different types of beings and the different types of what their primary trait is, what they're really good at, and the types of magic that they might have access to, and that kind of comes out in the game. And then down here, I've got a whole big pile of just ideas for talents and corruptions and kind of guidelines for how those function. The talent list, how standard ones work, how talents that require you to spend a spirit, how those work because they're a little more powerful, because you're spending a limited resource called spirit, and then corruptions, of course, are nasty and icky. And then I've got just some basic ideas broken down. You'll see there's more information for some of these, like humans have all sorts of ideas, gnomes and pixies, stonekin have a bunch of ideas, wildkin have a bunch of ideas. Those are the character archetypes, the playbooks that I've developed for playtesting, so I have more stuff developed on that. And then here's a whole bunch of tables that I haven't really filled in because I've just been doing it in the character write-ups. And then all sorts of adventure ideas for just in this outline, which is like breaking out adventures as a bunch of different things. You've got combat-oriented adventures that are focused around investigation, some that are more social and about character interaction, some are there about your resilience and your personal ability to withstand what the void is doing, and then skill adventures as well that kind of touch on a bunch of that stuff. So they're a little more varied. So you'll see adventures that do some of these different things. So you can run a single adventure that is, for example, combat oriented. It's kind of geared toward that. And then, the characters will be fighting a bunch. But you can also have, for example, an adventure that is skill based, which is like they'll be doing a lot of different things. So, and then here's like a bunch of stuff that I kind of abandoned. I keep the information in the outline just so that I can come back to it. This outline is a mess. I apologize if you're looking through this and pausing the screen and looking and reading stuff. Like there's stuff in here that's never going to make it into the game. But I throw it in order to keep track of it because I may return to an idea. And then I've got, a list of inspiration, primarily movies, but I'm sure I'll build that out into comics and TV shows and novels and so forth. The big ones up here are kind of Labyrinth, Princess Bride, Dark Crystal, Pan's Labyrinth, Neverending Story, Dragon Slayer, Willow, Legend, and there's a whole bunch of others that might see some sort of build, and you might see something in an adventure or in a character that is like, oh, that's like what a character in that's something that Edward Scissorhands did, just because that's a kind of a modern day fantasy fable, and I thought there's probably some stuff about Edward Scissorhands that I'd like to kind of embody in a character type, potentially, if I'm inspired. And then that's the end of the outline. So that's kind of the basic rundown of how that works. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in. I would appreciate interactivity in all of this. Feel free to chime in. But that's what the outline kind of looks like, and I'm going to just throw this down out of the way here a little bit. The playtest materials are basically two PDFs that, the rules are just kind of laid out in, you'll see, like 2 pages. They're bullet points. I haven't written it up as a rule set yet because it's too early to nail that all down. There will come a point where I'm going to need to actually write this up in actual text, in paragraphs, with everything in the right order, so that all the information is presented in such a way that you can absorb all of it. But for right now, it's an outline. The bulk of the game mechanics fits on 1 page, which is important to me for this game because I want to keep it simple. I want people to absorb the rules very quickly. If they're going to play the game for the first time, they should be able to read the rules in 10 minutes and be ready to go. So there's just a lot of guidelines for the game mechanics. Those are the 4 playbooks that are available in playtesting right now. Human, which is what you think them to be. Humans are from Earth, and they go to the world of Reverie, where the game takes place. So you're thinking about like characters, human characters, but particularly you want them to be like somebody from outside the world. Then there's the Pixies, which are like kind of what you expect them to be. Stonekin are essentially rock elemental fae types, rock and stone and earth and dirt and metal, and they have abilities that kind of tie into that. And then Wildkin are, if you've seen Labyrinth, Wildkin are inspired by Sir Didymus, who is the little fox person who rides around on a dog. So Wildkin are kind of built off of that, so you can be different types of foxkin or wildkin. So you can be a fox person or a badger person or a rabbit person or an otter person. And I added otter because somebody in a previous playtest said, I want to play an otter person. So ta-da! There's an otter person now. So you can be a cute little otter person. And then the rundown of character creation, and there's a little bit of information about safety tools, because this game can potentially get a little dark, and it can be talking about loss and things that characters kind of face in sort of a dark way. And so I'm going to make sure that there are safety tools built into the game, that people can talk before the game begins and talk about boundaries, about like, I don't want this sort of thing in there. For example, I just recently lost my mother. My mother just passed away. So I would prefer not to have to deal with the concept of losing a parent right now, because that is going to yank me out of the game and make this unfun for me. So the idea is to establish general boundaries for the game overall, things that you don't want to touch one way or the other. If somebody has a phobia of fire, there will be nothing on fire in the game. At different times, the GM will be able to check in with the players during a campaign, and there might be a player who has just lost a parent, and they don't want to have to deal with that in game, because they're trying to play this game and have fun and put the real world aside. So I want to incorporate ways of just kind of addressing that as you play the game in a campaign as well. Games Inc., I agree, safety tools are great. They're definitely they're basically needed in pretty much any game, but certainly they are needed in certain types of games. Monster Hearts does a great job of talking about safety tools, because Monster Hearts is all about being a monster type person, a vampire, werewolf, whatever, in high school, and the game is an allegory for being an outcast in high school. And so you can play the game and kind of fantasize and take control of being that outcast and be able to kind of buck against that. But there are certain things that maybe you don't want to have to deal with because they're just too touchy of a subject for you. So let's keep those out of the game so that everybody enjoys themselves. That's the basic rundown of the game. It's kind of how this playtest document is set up. This is all it is for these early playtests, is just a couple pages. And then, I have a little outline write-up for the adventure that I'm running for the playtest, but I haven't really worked out the adventure format for those 2-page adventure spreads. I'm going to get to that eventually. Right now I'm just kind of winging it. But the players get the playbooks for the different types of characters, and here are humans and things that they can do. And you've got, of course, your body, mind, charm, and heart. traits. You've got skill, spirit, and shadow for your tracks. There's conditions, which is like, getting injured and so forth. So, and then all of your kind of character information, like your character's name, what they look like, what they fear, so forth. And then the real meat of each character playbook is on the right side page, which is their talents and their corruptions that they have available to them in their playbook. Initially, I had 3 corruptions for each character, but also then like 6 or 7 talents that they could choose from. And when you started your character, when you first had a starting character, you would have 2. You'd pick 2 talents, and as you progress your character, you could gain more. Early playtests said, we as gamers are used to the idea of certain character archetypes having abilities that are kind of built into them, they're baked into that character. So for this round here now, there are always 3 talents. You'll see there are the check boxes are filled in right up at the top here. Those 3 talents are common to that particular type. So humans are complex of character, they have a favored item, and they are tenacious. And that is something that humans always get. So when you play the game, if somebody else is playing a human, you can count on them for those things. And given that the characters are working together to save their frickin' world, it's good that they can count on other characters for certain things. They can always do these things. And then you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 additional talents for each of the character playbooks. And they're a wide variety of things, and they do all sorts of different things. They affect body or trait checks in different ways. They allow you to do things that kind of break the rules. They give you bonuses to different things and allow you to use skill, spirit, and shadow in different ways. Like with humans, you might have a human who's impetuous, and they can spend a spirit to automatically succeed at a body check, but they hurt themselves in the process and mark 1 condition. They take a check on the condition track. They hurt themselves, and it kind of goes from there. The different playbooks have at least 1 ability to do magic of some sort. In the case of the human, they can't start with the touch of magic. They can gain that later. The other Fey beings can start with some amount of magic. And it's interesting to note that anytime it's a magic kind of thing, it says magic in parentheses, and then it lists some kind of sort of schools of magic or realms of magic, so they can do magical things that kind of fit that. So like a human can do magic that affects the body, the mind, or the senses. And basically those magic abilities they're like things that you could otherwise do. They're minor magics, things that you could otherwise do with a body, mind, or charm check, but you'll instead make a heart check to do it. So if you want to take touch of magic, for a human, it would be a good idea to have more than 1 die in heart, because that will allow you to do all sorts of interesting minor magical things with touch of magic. And then you've got corruptions. Right now, corruptions are set up in such a way that they always mark a shadow. Like you get corruptions by having shadow get marked a bunch, and then when you use corruptions, it marks more shadow because it pulls you deeper and deeper. Corruptions make you more and more corrupt. And for any given playbook, the corruptions there's 3 of them. 2 of them mark a shadow when you use them, and 1 of them marks a permanent shadow, which is to say you permanently fill in one of your shadow track boxes. And so those are really powerful and really dark and nasty, and they make you even easier to corrupt down the road because they permanently fill in a shadow track. So if you use Foul Mirror for a human, your shadow detaches from your body and can perform tasks using your trait scores. The shadow is invisible at night, and it can fly, and you can see and hear through it. So for basically an entire scene of the story, your shadow can do all sorts of really great things, but you mark a permanent shadow in the process. And so when you start marking additional shadow from your trait checks, one's already marked, and it will always be marked. So Follow Mirror can only be used so many times, or you will really hamstring your character. And you will run them into corruption and eventually falling to corruption completely much more quickly. So that's the human. Stonekin, again, are like the rock people. Their talents are, big things. The Stonekin are emotionally deep. They feel everything very deeply, so they connect with people emotionally. They have unweathered body, which allows them to gain advantage on body checks to resist damage. They're super tough. And then a bunch of other things here, including the namesake talent called Good Strong Hands, which allows a Stonekin to gain advantage, their body check goes down to target number 4 whenever they're doing something with their hands. And if you know the Neverending Story, you will know Rockbiter, the giant earth elemental guy who talks about how he tried to stop the nothing, and he couldn't. And he says, and you would think these are good, strong hands. I always thought they were good, strong hands. And he was unable to stop them. So that's where that came from. And also the title of the game. And still form allows them to, look like rock. They can just stop moving and be perfectly camouflaged. And corruptions that do, like, obviously petrification is a very appropriate one for them because they're stone beings. Pixies are what you think of as pixies. They're little people, little elven people with wings. They have a boundless heart, so they gain an advantage to charm checks. They're flitter quick, which means they can avoid taking conditions from physical fighting as long as they have spirit available. It's because they're super fast and little and tiny, and they get out of the way. And then they have there's a talent here called Vine Twine, which is a magical kind of thing that's built off of light and plants and all sorts of other little fun things, including being able to grant wishes, which is actually shadow magic. So they mark a permanent spirit, and they don't get to have as much spirit piled up. So if you use the wish too often, you won't be able to gain as much spirit and have that stockpiled for your use later. And they also have, as a corruption, a selfish wish. They can make a wish that benefits themselves. Normally their wishes have to benefit the wisher. And that the selfish wish, of course, marks permanent shadow. And if they do that too many times, they become much more easy to corrupt. And then the Wildkin, which are the animal people, they have an animal form, which, as I talked about, is a badger or a fox or an otter or a rabbit, and they can, transform into that animal. They can talk to that animal. They can move like that animal, and a whole bunch of other interesting things here. I made Wildkin have the ability to be fearless, inspired by Sir Didymus from Labyrinth. That Sir Didymus never backs down. He's ready for adventure at any moment, and that's kind of what Wildkin can do. And they can also have a cool sword, just like Sir Didymus did. Sir Didymus did. That there you go. And then corruptions where they kind of become more animalistic and feral, where they have a sickening bite, or they become rabidly ferocious. And they can normally they're very good friends, like their ability up here, true friends, and with their corruption, they can destroy the bonds of friendship between people, and permanently sully that relationship. So that's the basic rundown of what I have to talk to you about. If you have questions, please go ahead and post them. I'm going to roll back up to the Stonekin, I think. Feel free to chime in here. The process while I'm waiting for questions, the process for developing all this was like just kind of a slow iteration of all sorts of abilities. And I know that it's going to get even uglier trying to come up with talents and corruptions that don't cross over with one another, because I want each of the playbooks for the characters to be unique. They won't they'll never share talents or corruptions. Each of them will have unique talents and corruptions. And right now I have 4 characters. There will come a point when I'm going to have a total of 10. So I'm 40% of my way to developing talents and corruptions. Of course, there will be adjustments for playtesting. But I have a feeling that when I get to those last few talents and corruptions for the last couple of character playbooks, that's going to get a little rough, because I'm going to have a hard time making sure that I don't step on other character playbooks' toes. Will this be, Clear Shades asks, will this be a standalone book, or do you expect supplements? My intention is that the book will stand alone as it is. It'll be 100 pages. That'll kind of give you everything you need to play the game. 10 character types, a whole bunch of adventures, basic rules, and then, of course, some alternate stuff, some inspirational kind of stuff, some lists of things to help you kind of develop things, and then illustrations and nice layout and all that. Will there ever be supplements for additional crunch for the games, like new character types, additional adventure write-ups and stuff? There might be. I could see myself doing a small booklet if this game takes off and warrants a supplement. I have no intention of generating a setting book. The idea, which I kind of glossed over and I didn't get into, is that the world is called Reverie. And the idea is that as a part of the game, the players and the GM will generate the world as they play. So there'll be some basic guidelines for this is what these different types of characters are like in this world. This is what a wildkin is like. This is what pixies are typically like. And there'll be all sorts of general, like there's goblins and there's ogres and so forth, and there'll be lists of like interesting locations, like there'll be a bog of eternal stench or something akin to that that's listed or maybe talked about in an adventure. But I'm not going to create a map. I am not going to define the whole world and set up little towns and kingdoms and all that sort of thing. My intention with this is for it to be very narrative-oriented and very cooperative with the players and the GMs building the world as they go. So much so that the GM guidelines include things, information for the GMs to prompt questions, loaded questions for the players. As you play the game, I can set up a town that you're going to, and I can ask you, for example, I can say all of the buildings in this town are single story and made of wood, but there's one building that is different than all the others. What is that? Player A, and that player will tell me what that building is. It might be a tower or a meeting hall or a witch's home, or it could be whatever that player comes up with. And then the GM can incorporate that in some way, because there will be information in the adventures that give you story beats and ideas and things that the characters need to do. And now that player has described this interesting location, I can now set some of that action in that location. And the idea there being that it will invest the players in the story as they go, because they will help to create part of it. Because Reverie, the world that this is set in, is all part of sort of a dream that everybody is having together. It's a story that you're all telling together. So everybody gets some level of ownership. And for players, it's not just the agency of your characters. It's also describing specific instances and ideas of whoever's playing the pixie might define what pixie society is like, or what pixie religion is like. A player might describe what a particular forest looks like, or what it's named, and everybody builds the world together. So that's my hope. That's the plan. Here's hoping that it's a fair bit different from Capers and Murders and Acquisitions, which kind of have worlds and settings and backdrops kind of built into them. Games Inc. says, I would love to try GMing this when you're ready for other players to take a shot. There will certainly be playtesting where I'll write the whole thing up fully as with all of not just outline and bullet points. It'll be like, okay, here's 8 pages that describe the rules, and because ultimately, as a game designer, You need to put it in the hands of other people. You need other players to be able to take on the role of GM and say, okay, we're going to read this, and like, do I understand how this game is played? So some of the players now who are playtesting early on will get a sense of everything. And if they become GMs for their own group, they will kind of have that experience to draw upon. But I expect that I'll also find playtest groups where I'll have the GM doesn't know the game. They've not played it. And their feedback will be invaluable to make sure that I'm describing everything properly and making sure that somebody reading the game book can figure out how to play it. Because when you get right down to it, in addition to all the wonderful things like characters and adventures and spells and powers and feats and combat abilities and so forth that make an RPG happen, a game book is also a technical manual. It needs to teach you how to play the game, just like a technical manual for a computer teaches you how to use the computer, and teaches you all the ins and outs and nuances of the computer. So that's where I'm at. I think we're probably going to stick with just talking about Good Strong Hands, because we've gone into quite a bit of depth, and quite frankly, there are people who are going to be playtesting who I think will probably enjoy listening to this after the fact. So if anybody else has any other questions they'd like to throw out, or just things to say that will keep me entertained while we wait for questions from people who might have them, because there is a bit of a delay as I talk here. I'm waiting for people to type into the chat with any questions or comments that they have. While I'm waiting for that, I'll just kind of float through here. The Stonekin can bellow, can deafen creatures. Because Stonekin are gigantic, and bellow was kind of built out of the idea of an earthquake, with like a large sound that frightens you, and in the case of bellow, it deafens. Oh, what else do we have? Pixies. Pixies are normally happy and fun and go lucky, and then they also have an ability called Furious Anger, where they can gain advantage on body checks, and they can kind of really tear things up, but they hurt themselves in the process because they're pixies and they're small and kind of frail. They also have True Sense, which makes their mind checks to see or hear things always a target number 4, so the lowest target number. So they can sense things more easily. Oh boy, Clear Shade says, is there a character from the source materials that you specifically chose not to include? And by source materials, I assume you mean like the kind of the movies that I'm inspired by. Is there a character that I chose not to include? Well, not specifically that I can think of off the top of my head. I mostly just picked like my favorite characters that I thought like, well, these characters have interesting qualities, and what can I turn them into? I did for quite a while, until very recently, have dwarves as one of the types of characters that you could play. And they weren't going to be dwarves so much like the D&D dwarves. They were going to be dwarves. The idea was to have them to be more like Willow, the character Willow from the movie Willow. So, they're short of stature. They have like these nice little towns. They have a little bit of, at least some of the characters have a little bit of sorcery ability. There's some magic there. But they're otherwise kind of diminutive. With strong familial ties and so forth. And I toyed around with the dwarves thing, and I kept thinking, like, if I don't make these like D&D dwarves, the term dwarf has a connotation in the real world, which is to say a little person, and dwarf and midget, and all those words are, like, I don't want to use those words to connote that sort of thing. So I was thinking, well, maybe like those types of characters need to be named something else. Can I come up with a name that works for that? And the more I thought about it, I found myself saying, no, I'm going to put them aside. Maybe I'll do something with that. Don't get me wrong. The things that Willow does in the movie, some of those things are going to be available because there's magical stuff that he does that I want to make sure has sort of a place in the game. But that society of those types of people aren't part of the game anymore, so I guess I kind of removed them, and I instead decided to include red caps, which are kind of red caps in my game are intended to be kind of they're fighty, they're kind of they're difficult to get along with. They're a little socially they're not they don't get along the best with other characters. And red caps, they have a kind of an angry streak to them, and they have some talents and corruptions that are geared toward combat. Despite the fact that red caps are small, they're short. And the red cap, of course, is based on that's an actual fey creature of legend from the UK. So I'm building out of that, and rather than the dwarf thing. And gnomes are still in there, and I felt that worked okay. And I'll probably stick with gnomes as being kind of industrious tinkerers. They create things. But given that I wasn't doing dwarves as D&D style dwarves, living under the ground, making weapons and armor, gold and silver and gems and all that sort of thing. I didn't want to hearken to that. I wanted, something that people would recognize and that would be interesting, but didn't necessarily scream D&D, because I want to avoid letting people fall too easily into D&D tropes, because the game is not D&D. It shares some ideas, but it's not D&D at all. And that's why there's no elf, for example. Even though we're talking fey creatures, there's no elf. I named nothing elf. At one point, I considered giving these different fey beings like made-up names, but I thought that's just going to be, at some point, that's going to get confusing. Like, what is a Google-lug? Like a Google-lug. What is a Google-lug? What does it do? What do Google-lugs? What are they good at? What are they like? It's another thing to remember. So the character types that I invented names for, those names are descriptive of what they are. Like a stone kin isn't a Google-lug. It's not called Google-lug because that's a confusing word that you don't know. But stone kin means something. It means they are kin to stone. That is, they are related to stone and earth and metal and so forth. And the same goes for woodkin and wildkin. So I kind of built the made-up names to be descriptive so that they wouldn't be confusing. And then all the other ones are things like fauns and brownies and pixies and things that you recognize from fantasy tropes and fantasy stories. There's humans, but there's also a type of human called Fey Touched. The idea there being that humans are they're humans who have come from another world. They are Bastion in Neverending Story, for example, that they're human. Otherwise, they're not Fey. They're not natives to Reverie. But some humans stay behind in Reverie. They live there. They have families, and their children are Fey touched. They're still kind of human, but they're touched by the Fey-ness of the world of Reverie. So there'll be a character type called Fey Touched that will be sort of, they're kind of half-elves, but since there's no elves, they're not really half-elves. They're just humans who have more Fey blood or influence to them. So, any other questions? Let's see, what other, go back to have I missed, let me float through here. Did we talk about brownies, which are like little impish kind of trickster types? Fauns, which are Mr. Tumnus from Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Gnomes, we talked about. Pixies, redcap, stonekin, wildkin, woodkin. That's everybody. And there's your types of magics again, and different fey types, different character types have access to different ones. So pixies, for example, their magic is plant and light based. Brownies, because they're tricky types, get illusions and trickery. And so when they have talents that have a magical bent to them, some of their minor magic capability will come about in illusions and trickery. So that's where I'm at. Any other questions throw out there? Otherwise, we'll wrap this up fairly shortly. I don't want to leave anybody hanging with a question. The last one we had was regarding characters from the source material. that I didn't include, and that may happen. There may come a point where I say, I don't want to include this particular person, this character, although it's not so much about the characters. You will find, for example, it's about the characters' traits. It's about things that the characters do. There are some that are pretty obvious, like Una from Legend. You'll see a lot of Una in the Pixie. A lot of what the Pixie can do is based off of Una. Not all of it, certainly, but a bunch of it. But then, for example, Stonekin, they have the ability to move rocks around, rocks and stone, and create things out of them. And that's something that Ludo does in Ludo in Labyrinth. He's that big furry guy that smells bad, where he moves, he magically moves rocks around. So Stonekin are sort of Ludo, except that Ludo is big and furry with horns, and Stonekin aren't. So there's aspects of characters from these stories that are making their way in, and some of these aspects are from those stories that I listed, and very fantasy-oriented stories, fantasy stories about very, very bad things happening, or about humans going to fantastical realms like Labyrinth. Labyrinth isn't about the world ending, but it is about a human going to this fantastical place, which is, kind of in there in humans. So there are things about humans as they're written that are kind of drawn from those characters, who travel to fantastic places in those movies. And as I go along, I'll continue to watch movies and take notes, and I'll reference comic books and novels and so forth. I'm going to reach out to people who are younger than me and who aren't going to necessarily know who all these characters and movies are from the 80s, and find things from later than the 80s that kind of are touchstones for these characters in the game. But yeah, it's a hodgepodge that just slowly kind of gets built up from all sorts of ideas, and that's where all of my games and all my game design work has started, is just a pile of ideas, and then you slowly kind of weed out the things that don't really fit. You set them aside. Maybe they'll inspire something else later, and you find the things that really do fit, and those things become intrinsic to what the game is about. Like, there are character talents that are in there that are right out of that, out of those movies that I'm referencing, that I feel like are intrinsic to the story of that character and what happens in those movies, and I want to embody that in some way in this game, so that a person can play the game, Good Strong Hands, and be like, I'm not playing Ludo, but I'm doing a Ludo thing. And so they recognize that, and that gives them a little sense of like, oh, that's fun. That's like, I'm doing a Ludo thing, or I'm doing an Una thing, or I'm doing a Jack from Legend thing. Or like in the adventure side of things, I'm facing a demon, and that demon has some things about them in the adventure write-up that are kind of like the character of Darkness from Legend, the big devil-looking guy, voiced and played by Tim Curry. There will be things that come from these inspirations that will be kind of morphed into the game, and so you'll recognize them and you'll enjoy them, and that's just another level of, you're calling upon fantasy tropes that you're also calling upon these movies and these character actions and moments that you recognize, and you can kind of make that happen. You can play a Wildkin, and you can be kind of like Sir Didymus, because he's fearless and he's got a little sword, and even though he's small, he's a real ass kicker, because Sir Didymus is full of bluster in the movie, and you can be that character, or at least have some of that embodied in your Wildkin character. You won't be playing Sir Didymus, but you'll be playing a Sir Didymus-like character with some other cool stuff to make him different. So there you go. No other questions. I'm going to call this a stream. I'm going to call this a video. Thank you, everybody, for joining me. That's what she wrote for Good Strong Hands. I think there's a lot of information here for people who are interested. If you are interested in playtesting, either as an alpha playtester, as playing a character, or as becoming a GM for when I have that stuff ready, please email me at nerdburgergames@gmail.com. Make sure that the subject line says something like Good Strong Hands Playtesting, and I'll put you on the appropriate list to playtest now and keep you up on emails for signups for those playtests, or I'll put you on the list for I'm not ready to playtest right now, but I would really love to run this game when you've got the thing actually written up, and I've got if you've got a group of players who you think would really dig trying this game out and helping me to shape it into its final form. And that is very, very important. I need those people. Please reach out at nerdburgergames@gmail.com. So that's everything, everybody. Thank you for coming along for the ride, people in the chat, people who are watching this later. I hope you enjoyed what I had to share with you. Good Strong Hands is rocking and rolling. It's going to be a game. I'm looking forward to it. Bye.